The economy of Mexico is the 15th largest in the world in nominal terms and the 11th largest by purchasing power parity, according to the International Monetary Fund. Since the 1994 crisis, administrations have improved the country's macroeconomic fundamentals. Mexico was not significantly influenced by the recent 2002 South American crisis, and maintained positive, although low, rates of growth after a brief period of stagnation in 2001. Mexico was one of the Latin American nations most affected by the 2008 recession, with its gross domestic product contracting by more than 6%. In spite of the Mexican economy's unprecedented macroeconomic stability, which has reduced inflation and interest rates to record lows and has increased per capita income, enormous gaps remain between the urban and the rural population, the northern and southern states, and the rich and the poor. Some of the government's challenges include the upgrade of infrastructure, the modernization of the tax system and labor laws, and the reduction of income inequality. The tax revenues, altogether 19.6% of GDP in 2013, are the lowest among the 34 OECD countries. The economy contains rapidly developing modern industrial and service sectors, with increasing private ownership. Recent administrations have expanded competition in ports, railroads, telecommunications, electricity generation, natural gas distribution and airports, with the aim of upgrading infrastructure. As an export-oriented economy, more than 90% of Mexican trade is under free trade agreements with more than 40 countries, including the European Union, Japan, Israel, and much of Central and South America. The most influential FTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement, which came into effect in 1994, and was signed in 1992 by the governments of the United States, Canada and Mexico. In 2006, trade with Mexico's two northern partners accounted for almost 90% of its exports and 55% of its imports. Recently, the Congress of the Union approved important tax, pension and judicial reforms, and reform to the oil industry is currently being debated. Mexico had 16 companies in the Forbes Global 2000 list of the world's largest companies in 2008. Mexico's labor force is 78 million. The OECD and WTO both rank Mexican workers as the hardest working in the world in terms of the amount of hours worked yearly, although profitability per man-hour remains low. History. Mexican President Porfirio Diaz brought unprecedented economic growth during the last quarter of the 19th century. This growth was accompanied by foreign investment and European immigration, the development of an efficient railroad network and the exploitation of the country's natural resources. Annual economic growth between 1876 and 1910 averaged 3.3%. Political repression and fraud, as well as huge income inequalities exacerbated by the land distribution system based on latifundios, in which large haciendas were owned by a few but worked by millions of underpaid peasants living in precarious conditions, led to the Mexican Revolution, an armed conflict that drastically transformed Mexico's political, social, cultural, and economical structure during the 20th century under a premise of social democracy. The war itself left a harsh toll on the economy and population, which decreased over the 11-year period between 1910 and 1921. The reconstruction of the country was to take place in the following decades. The period from 1930 to 1970 was dubbed by economic historians as the Mexican Miracle, a period of economic growth that followed the end of the Mexican Revolution and the resumption of capital accumulation during peacetime. During this period, the nation adopted the economic model of import substitution industrialization, which protected and promoted the development of national industries. Mexico experienced an economic boom through which industries rapidly expanded their production. Important changes in the economic structure included free land distribution to peasants under the concept of ejido, the nationalization of the oil and railroad companies, the introduction of social rights into the Constitution, the birth of large and influential labor unions, and the upgrading of infrastructure. While population doubled from 1940 to 1970, GDP increased sixfold during the same period. Growth while under the ISI model had reached its peak in the late 1960s. During the 1970s, the presidential administrations of Echeverría and López Portillo tried to include social development in their policies, an effort that entailed more public spending. With the discovery of vast oil fields in a time in which oil prices were surging and international interest rates were low and even negative, the government decided to borrow from international capital markets to invest in the state-owned oil company, which in turn seemed to provide a long-run income source to promote social welfare. This method produced a remarkable growth in public expenditure, and President López Portillo announced that the time had come to manage prosperity, as Mexico multiplied its oil production to become the world's fourth largest exporter. In the period of 1981–1982, the international panorama changed abruptly. Oil prices plunged and interest rates rose. In 1982, President López Portillo, just before ending his administration, suspended payments of foreign debt, devalued the peso and nationalized the banking system, along with many other industries that were severely affected by the crisis, among them the steel industry. While import substitution had been in use during an era of industrialization, by the 1980s it was evident that the protracted protection had produced an uncompetitive industrial sector with low productivity gains. President de la Madrid was the first of a series of presidents that began to implement neoliberal reforms. After the crisis of 1982, lenders were unwilling to return to Mexico and, in order to keep the current account in balance, the government resorted to currency devaluations, which in turn sparked unprecedented inflation, which reached a historic high in 1987 at 139.7%. The first step toward the liberalization of trade was Mexico's signature of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1986 under President de la Madrid. During the Salinas administration, many state-owned companies were privatized. The telephone company Telmex, a government monopoly, became a private monopoly, sold to Carlos Slim. Also not open to private investors were the government oil company Pemex or the energy sector. Furthermore, the banking system that had been nationalized in the waning hours of the López Portillo administration in 1982 were privatized. But with the exclusion of foreign banks, Salinas pushed for Mexico's inclusion in the North American Free Trade Agreement, expanding it from a U.S.-Canada agreement. The expanded NAFTA was signed in 1992, after the signature of two additional supplements on environment and labor standards. It came into effect on January 1, 1994. Salinas also introduced strict price controls and negotiated smaller minimum wage increments with the labor union movement under the aging Fidel Velázquez with the aim of curbing inflation. While his strategy was successful in reducing inflation, growth averaged only 2.8% a year. By fixing the exchange rate, the peso became rapidly overvalued while consumer spending increased, causing the current account deficit to reach 7% of GDP in 1994. The deficit was financed through tesobonos, a type of public debt instrument that reassured payment in dollars. The January 1994 Chiapas uprising, and the assassinations of the ruling party's presidential candidate in March 1994, Luis Naldo Colosio, and the Secretary General of the party and brother of the Assistant Attorney General José Francisco Ruiz Massieu in 1994, sent a disquieting message to investors. Public debt holders rapidly sold their tesobonos, depleting the central bank's reserves, while portfolio investments, which had made up 90% of total investment flows, left the country as fast as they had come in. This unsustainable situation eventually forced the entrant Zedillo administration to abandon the fixed exchange rate. The peso sharply devalued and the country entered into an economic crisis in December 1994. The boom in exports, as well as an international rescue package crafted by U.S. President Bill Clinton, helped cushion the crisis. In less than 18 months, the economy was growing again, and annual rate growth averaged 5.1% between 1995 and 2000. President Zedillo and President Fox, of the National Action Party, the first opposition party candidate to win a presidential election since the founding of the precursor of the Institutional Revolutionary Party in 1929, continued with trade liberalization. During Fox's administration, several FTAs were signed with Latin American and European countries, Japan and Israel, and both strove to maintain macroeconomic stability. Thus, Mexico became one of the most open countries in the world to trade, and the economy base shifted accordingly. Total trade with the United States and Canada tripled, and total exports and imports almost quadrupled between 1991 and 2003. The nature of foreign investment also changed, with a greater share of foreign direct investment over portfolio investment. Macroeconomic, financial and welfare indicators. Main indicators: Mexico's gross domestic products in purchasing power parity was estimated at US $2,143.499 billion in 2014, and $1,261.642 billion in nominal exchange rates. It is the fifth largest of emerging markets, behind China, Brazil, Russia, and India, and is the leader of the MIKT group. As such, its standard of living, as measured in GDP and PPP per capita, was US $16,949.70. The World Bank reported in 2009 that Mexico's gross national income in market exchange rates was the second highest in Latin America, after Brazil at US $1,830.392 billion, which led to the highest income per capita in the region at $14,400. As such, Mexico is now firmly established as an upper-middle-income country. After the slowdown of 2001, the country has recovered and has grown 4.2%, 3.0% and 4.8% in 2004, 2005 and 2006, even though it is considered to be well below Mexico's potential growth. The Mexican peso is the currency. 1 peso is divided into 100 centavos. MXN replaced MXP in 1993 at a rate of 1,000 MXP per 1 Mexican peso. The exchange rate has remained stable since 1998, oscillating between 10.20 and 11 equals 3 Mexican pesos and 50 centavos per US dollar. Interest rates in 2007 were situated at around 7%, having reached a historic low in 2002 below 5%. Inflation rates are also at historic lows. The inflation rate in Mexico in 2006 was 4.1% and 3% by the end of 2007. Unemployment rates are the lowest of all OECD member countries at 3.2%. However, underemployment is estimated at 25%. Mexico's Human Development Index was reported at 0.829, ranking 52 in the world within the group of high development. poverty. Poverty in Mexico is measured under parameters such as nutrition, clean water, shelter, education, health care, social security, quality and basic services in the household, income and social cohesion as defined by social development laws in the country. It is divided in two categories: moderate poverty and extreme poverty. While less than 2% of Mexico's population lives below the international poverty line set by the World Bank, as of 2013, Mexico's government estimates that 33% of Mexico's population lives in moderate poverty and 9% lives in extreme poverty, which leads to 42% of Mexico's total population living below the national poverty line. The huge gap might be explained by the government's adopting the multidimensional poverty method as a way to measure poverty. So a person who has an income higher than the international poverty line, or well-being income line, set by the Mexican government might fall in the moderate poverty category if he or she has one or more deficiencies related to social rights such as education, nutrition, or living standards. Extreme poverty is defined by the Mexican government as persons who have deficiencies in both social rights and an income lower than the well-being income line. Additional figures from SEDESOL estimates that 6% live in extreme poverty and suffer from food insecurity. Recently, extensive changes in government economic policy and attempts at reducing government interference through privatization of several sectors, for better or worse, allowed Mexico to remain the biggest economy in Latin America, until 2005 when it became the second largest, and a so-called trillion-dollar club member. Despite these changes, Mexico continues to suffer great social inequality and lack of opportunities. The current administration has made an attempt at reducing poverty in the country, to provide more opportunities to its citizens such as jobs, education, and the installation of universal health care. Income inequality: a single person in Mexico has a net worth equal to 8% of GDP. Carlos Slim. Additionally, only 10% of Mexicans represent 25% of Mexican GDP. A smaller group, 3.5%, represent 12.5% of Mexican GDP. According to the OECD, Mexico is the country with the second highest degree of economic disparity between the extremely poor and extremely rich, after Chile, although this gap has been diminishing over the last decade. The bottom 10% on the income rung disposes of 1.36% of the country's resources, whereas the upper 10% dispose of almost 36%. OECD also notes that Mexico's budgeted expenses for poverty alleviation and social development is only about a third of the OECD average, both in absolute and relative numbers. According to the World Bank, in 2004, 17.6% of Mexico's population lived in extreme poverty, while 21% lived in moderated poverty. Remittances, or contributions sent by Mexicans living abroad, mostly in the United States, to their families at home in Mexico, are a substantial and growing part of the Mexican economy. They comprised $22.4 billion in 2012. In 2004, they became the 10th largest source of foreign income after oil, industrial exports, manufactured goods, electronics, heavy industry, automobiles, construction, food, and banking and financial services. Remittances are a larger part of the Mexican economy than tourism expenditures and represented 2.1% of the nation's gross domestic product. The growth of remittances have more than doubled since 1997, although they have since decreased somewhat. Recorded remittance transactions exceeded 41 million in 2003, of which 86% were made by electronic transfer. The Mexican government, cognizant of the economic viability of immigrant workers, began issuing an upgraded version of the Matrícula Consular de Alta Seguridad, an identity document issued at Mexican consulates abroad. This document is now accepted as a valid identity card in 32 U.S. states, as well as thousands of police agencies, hundreds of cities and counties, as well as banking institutions. The main states receiving remittances in 2014 were Michoacán, Guanajuato, Jalisco, Mexico and Puebla, which jointly captured 45% of total remittances in that year. Several state governments, with the support of the federal government, have implemented programs to use part of the remittances to finance public works. This program, called Dos por Uno, is designed in a way that for each peso contributed by migrants from their remittances, the state and the federal governments will invest 2 pesos in building infrastructure at their home communities. Regional economies, regional disparities and income inequality are a feature of the Mexican economy. While all constituent states of the Federation have a Human Development Index higher than 0.70, the northern and central states have higher levels of HDI than the southern states. Nuevo Leon, Campeche and the Federal District have HDI levels similar to European countries, whereas that of Oaxaca and Chiapas is similar to that of China or Vietnam. At the municipal level, economic disparities are even greater. Delegación Benito Juárez in Mexico City has an HDI similar to that of Germany or New Zealand, whereas Metlatonoc in Guerrero would have an HDI similar to that of Malawi. The majority of the federal entities with high development are located in the northern region. The less developed states are located along the southern Pacific coast. In terms of share of the GDP by economic sector, the largest contributors in agriculture are Jalisco, Sinaloa and Veracruz. The greatest contributors in industrial production are the Federal District, State of Mexico and Nuevo Leon. The greatest contributors in the service sector are also the Federal District, State of Mexico and Nuevo Leon. Since the 1980s, the economy has slowly become less centralized. The annual rate of GDP growth of the Federal District from 2003 to 2004 was the smallest of all federal entities at a mere 0.23%, with drastic drops in the agriculture and industrial sectors. Nonetheless, it still accounts for 21.8% of the nation's GDP. The states with the highest GDP growth rates are Quintana Roo, Baja California, and San Luis Potosi. In 2000, the federal entities with the highest GDP per capita in Mexico were the Federal District, Campeche and Nuevo Leon. The states with the lowest GDP per capita were Chiapas, Oaxaca and Guerrero.